Hey everybody, Ketwolski here, checking in with another one of our hashtag Star Trek Picard episode discussion reviews. Today, of course, we're going to be talking about Picard Episode 8, Broken Pieces. So this is going to be that's probably one episode that a lot of you guys are going to disagree with me on. I have spent some time really thinking about this episode and kind of crafting my review, and unfortunately I have arrived at the conclusion that this one is probably my least favorite. You know, that's hard to say because this season has been so good all the way up to this point, so really it's the show's fault for raising the bar so high that this episode kind of didn't reach the same quality level for me personally that the other 7 episodes have, but I do have really good reasons for why I kind of have mixed to negative-ish feelings towards this episode. My biggest issues focus in on 2 areas: editing and really the story arc / pacing of the entire thing. But before we get into the negative stuff, I do want to go ahead and talk a little bit about the positive things. So let's go ahead and do that first. So one of the things that I really did enjoy about this episode was the relationship building between Picard and Soji. And it kind of started off a little bit rough in episode 7. Obviously, that was kind of the main focus point of that episode, was them kind of not trusting each other and then starting to work on it a little bit in this episode. Specifically, this scene here where they kind of talk a little bit about Data and kind of Soji's history and her story that she needs to go out and claim. And it was a very touching moment, especially at the end where she tells Picard that Data did in fact love him, and he kind of really takes that in, you know, and kind of accepts it as truth, whether she knows it to be or not. I think she's just kind of inferring that based off of the way everybody talks about him and the way that Picard talks about their friendship and relationship. I think that she's kind of just confirming something that he already knows. So it was a very touching scene. The next thing that I really enjoyed about this episode was Raffi's sort of investigation with what was going on with Rios utilizing the holograms. She put them all inside of the Picard den that they use as kind of like a ready room / break room area, and kind of interviewed all of them. And this was a really well done sequence. It was really funny. I really enjoyed seeing all of them together in the same place and seeing all their different personalities. We did learn in this episode that it is in fact that all of these guys are different facets of Rios's personality, which is something I theorized about, I think, way back in like episode 2 or 3. So that is confirmed. These are all different kind of parts of his personality because I guess he got scanned when he entered the ship, and then it just attached his personality and his look to all the different programs, and he never bothered to change it. But he did make some slight changes along the way. I assume that's probably with certain personalities and a little bit of the accents, maybe some of the outfits perhaps, I don't know, but this was a really fun sequence. Obviously, one of the really awesome things that happened in this episode was 7 of 9 kind of becoming a pseudo-Borg queen. It's not quite clear if now the cubes appear to have their own kind of artificial intelligence, because when she got disconnected from the tubes, it almost seemed as though a Borg entity was talking out of Seven's mouth. It wasn't quite the collective, but it was certainly something. But I really did enjoy this. This was really cool to see the tubes kind of connect into her, and kind of her really just deciding at that moment that she really needs to protect the XBs and the rest of the drones, and basically save, you know, herself and Elnor on that Borg cube. So she kind of does a little bit of a sacrifice here to really reconnect into this cube and do something that she's clearly not wanting to do. But this was a really fantastic sequence. I really loved this. Speaking of that same sequence, I really thought it was cool when all of the different kind of regeneration bays kind of activated, and it was all the drones saying, "We are Borg, we are Borg." Really, really cool. I did like the secondary sequence to this when all of the Romulans flushed the Borg drones out into space. That was a really intense sequence, and I don't know if that means that they're dead, because the Borg don't actually need oxygen in order to survive, at least not the, you know, regular drones. I don't know about the XBs. They probably do. I don't know how all that works, but they probably are not dead, so they're just floating outside the cube. So I don't know if they're going to do something in the next episode where they pull them all back inside so she can reconnect them back into, you know, the different regeneration bays, or puts them into stasis, or whatever she's going to do with them. I'm not quite sure. Or if they're just going to leave them out into space. I don't know exactly what the deal is, but those 2 sequences were really cool. One of the other things that I really enjoyed about this episode was this cool briefing sequence between all of the main characters on board La Sirena. I liked the fact that they were essentially kind of like recapping what was going on for not only us, the audience, but between each other. Now, there was a couple of little logic leaps here of information that we as the audience kind of knew, but these characters probably didn't know. But you could kind of write them off, in my opinion, as these were part of Raffi's sort of investigations into the whole situation with the Conclave of 8 and who Commodore O is, and the Zhat Vash and this whole conspiracy behind behind the Mars attack. So she probably had a lot of information off camera that we weren't really shown on screen. So it kind of makes sense a little bit that way, but I did like the fact that they all kind of sat together and had a little moment between everyone. And the final thing that I really enjoyed were these cool looking Romulan ships. They were all warping away from the cube. Obviously, A, because they've lost control of the cube, so they need to get the heck out of there. And then, of course, B, because they're on their way to go and supposedly attack Soji's home world because they know the location of it and they're on their way to do that. Now, that was very, very cool. I did enjoy that quite a bit. Okay, so that wraps up the fun things that I really enjoyed about this episode. Now it's time to kind of get into what I didn't really like. And we'll start it off with the shorter version of it, which was the editing. This has been slightly less noticeable, I should say, in the previous episodes. It was a bit noticeable in episode 7, but I kind of let it slide because there was a lot of stuff happening, and obviously the Rikers were back, so it didn't really bother me all that much. But this one, it was extraordinarily noticeable with the different editing and pacing of the two plots that were going on. So we have the La Serena crew doing their thing on the ship, and then of course we have Elnor and Seven doing stuff on the cube. And they tried to intercut these things throughout the entire length of the episode to kind of keep the energy up, number one, but to also try to showcase the passage of time on both locations. And in episode 7, a whole day goes by on the Riker farm, but it feels as though only a couple of minutes actually went by on the cube where, Hugh gets killed and all that. And this one even goes faster where the crew's kind of hanging out on La Serena, and it's unclear exactly how much time has gone by, but it's at least a few hours based off of how long it takes Rios to get completely drunk and then sober up and then have the conversation with the crew at the end. So, and Picard does a costume change, at some point during the episode as well. So at least a day has gone by, I would say. Maybe half a day has gone by, but the Seven and Elnor story, it feels like mere minutes go by during that time period. So the editing feels a little bit off in that regard because it's just feel like they're trying to stretch out that part of the storyline, but things happen extraordinarily quickly. Like Seven just arrives immediately at the beginning of the episode. She immediately goes to the Queen Cove and starts activating the thing for regeneration, and then the Romulans immediately evacuate. And I wish we had spent a little bit more time with that. Like, did they save the scientists that were on board? Did they leave them behind? Did they leave all their equipment behind? What are all the XBs were doing? We saw them towards the end, and we know that they were trying to kill them off. Obviously, Narissa was running around kind of shooting everybody and stuff like that, at least as many of the XBs as she could. But I wish we had spent a little bit more time with that whole evacuation of the Borg cube piece to kind of, extend that out a little bit, because honestly, if you really condensed all of the Seven and Elnor subplot storyline, it feels like just a few minutes go by, but they kind of stretch it out throughout the episode, and it was kind of noticeable for me, and I did not really like the way that it was kind of edited in that way. It was actually a little frustrating because everything on the La Serena seemed to be going very, very slowly, which is typical of this show, so that makes more sense, but everything on the cube was happening way, way too quickly, so that juxtaposition was really, really jarring, at least for me. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about, I don't want to say the writing because the dialogue was really great, but honestly, a lot of the plot elements that were in this episode, really they tried to set up a lot of things and then immediately cut them right off at their knees, and it was a little frustrating for me. I noticed it initially at first, and then I was like, okay, it's not so bad, but then it continued to happen throughout the episode, and I'm going to give you guys some specific examples. So, for instance, we have this whole sequence where Seven decides, okay, I'm going to decide to reintegrate with the collective, or not the collective, but the Borg cube itself, which is kind of a pseudo-collective, I guess, because it has like an AI, and then she connects to all these drones, and, talks about how I'm going to potentially, have to, re-assimilate people or assimilate Romulans and do all this other stuff. And it was this very seriously impactful moment that she reconnects to the tubes, and she's activating all these drones, and it was this very, very serious moment, and then they immediately undercut that by the Romulans just blowing them out into space. And yeah, that was a cool sequence, but ultimately it felt like there was not a strong payoff for that really emotional and, very character-driven setup. Another one is Soji commandeers the ship. The La Serena, she commandeers it, and she's like, I'm going to take this. There was this big emotional kind of, intense moment there where everyone was kind of arguing, like, give me back my ship, only for her to have control of it for like a few minutes for Rios to just immediately turn off all the systems and get back control. So it was like this really thing that was kind of happening, this really important thing that was happening, and they immediately cut it off again. Another situation is Picard finally has a chance to really stick it to Admiral Clancy and kind of prove to her that he was right and that she was completely wrong for not trusting in him. And she just dunks on his ass again by cursing at him, telling him basically that he's an idiot and that she's going to be sending a fleet to go and assist him, a squadron or whatever, to go and meet up with him at, Deep Space 12 or whatever. It just felt kind of like an undercut a little bit. Again, like they were just cut it off. Like the setup was there for him to really stick it to her, and then they just cut it off, which was, again, rather frustrating. Captain Picard was being a bit more captain-like towards the end of episode 7. He was kind of like, oh, I'm going to be more curious. I'm going to be more like my Picard self, and I'm going to be more like the old captain that people remembered. And that seemed to be like his overarching character arc for this entire season. But then as soon as he gets back on La Sirena, he's like screaming at Rios, he's arguing with Raffi, he seems only caring about what's going on, with Soji, and then he's both kind and also kind of a jerk to Agnes for good reason, but it was a little all over the place. And again, like they set up this whole thing where he was going to start acting a certain way, and then the very first sequence that we see him in on La Sirena, he's just kind of being a bit of a jerk. I don't know, it just kind of felt weird, it kind of felt off, like they were setting that up in episode 7 for him to be acting a certain way, for them to just come in again and just cut it off at the knees. It was very strange. Another thing that kind of got cut off again was Raffi doing the whole interview with all of the different, holograms on La Sirena. It was a really fun sequence, and it was funny. But ultimately, she didn't learn anything. She learned all the information she actually had from the 2 conversations with the navigation machine hologram and the engineering hologram. And then when she set them all in the room, she learned absolutely no new information, and then just went to Rios's room anyways and just got all the information for him, as he kind of talked about his feelings, which, I don't know, it just felt like it was kind of a waste in some regards, which is a little frustrating because the sequence itself is really fun, but it ultimately served no purpose. So it was like they set up this really great thing, and then they just kind of cut it off by her learning nothing and just going to Rios anyways and kind of just learning about what was happening and the whole situation and kind of his connection to Soji. So again, it was a bit of a cutoff at the knees. So talking a little bit about the story stuff, again, I wasn't super excited about the idea that Rios's backstory connected to the Asha android / whatever the heck Bruce Maddox was doing on this mystery planet that we're going to go visit. I don't like that idea of everything being super connected. I know a lot of franchises are doing that now. That doesn't necessarily make it a good thing. It's just as like, okay, so out of all of the pilots in the entirety of the quadrant, Picard happens to know and hire, or Raffi knows and happens to hire for Picard, the one guy that also knows who the Asha twins are and the these androids and stuff like that. It was like, okay. And I get that we wanted to add that element in there, that there are other ones, that there are male versions of these Asha androids that Maddox is working on, and B, that they had been sent out to do different things, not just uncover what was going on inside of the situation in this whole conspiracy with Mars, which was interesting and I liked it. But them connecting it to Rios was like, it just wasn't my personal flavor of things. That's more of a personal nitpick, but the other stuff that I'm talking about, like with the editing and the pacing and stuff like that, and the kind of setups and payoffs within the episode, are really kind of technical issues, I think, that really could have probably been cleaned up a little bit, before they went ahead and started rolling the cameras on this particular episode. So it kind of ends off on my things I didn't like about this episode. I know it was quite a bit. I know that some of you guys are going to have some really, good comebacks for all the things that I complained about. And of course, this is my opinion of this episode. You may, of course, have your own opinion about this episode. That doesn't necessarily make my opinion more right than yours. Let's just keep the conversations respectful down below, as I'm sure some of you guys are going to feel rather strong about the comments that I made. Okay, so now that all of that stuff is out of the way, let's go ahead and jump right into some of the cool theories and plot movement forward that we got in this episode. Okay, so a couple of really big important things kind of came out in this episode. Number one, we know that Commodore O, I guess, is sort of running things in the Zhat Vash, and the Zhat Vash are the ones who are activating this ritualistic device that shows them an image of what is to come. And we'll get into what that is and kind of how that's set up here in a minute. But what we learned here is that, one, Narissa has gone through this particular ceremony. It's unclear if Narek has gone through it or if men specifically are not allowed to go through it because it was only women at this particular ceremony. It's unclear at this particular point, but what we also learn is A, Narissa and Narek are for sure brother and sister, at least as far as I know, and that Ramda, the girl from the Romulan girl all the way from back in episode 2, I believe it was, is in fact Narissa and Narek's aunt, which is kind of interesting. This connection didn't seem as jarring to me as the whole situation with Rios and the other synthetic life forms. Again, this is kind of a whole thing of like, like everything has to be super connected. But it was an interesting thing to kind of add a little bit of depth into Narissa and, of course, Narek's kind of backstory and a little bit about who Ramda is. So when the Zhat Vash kind of initiates, I guess you could call it, activate this device on the planet, they get a flood of images, and most of it is some of the stuff that we've seen before, like the planets exploding, you know, different things like creatures dying. There was like a fox decomposing. There was like suns kind of, you know, kind of in space, kind of looks like they were exploding also. We saw like a baby fetus. We saw like DNA strands. We saw like, you know, like viruses infecting blood, it looked like almost, and kind of exploding. But we saw one thing that was really, really interesting, which was this shot here. So we looked at this android, this kind of stock android shot from the previous, you know, preview of this episode that we talked about in episode 7, and then it morphs itself into the Data Soong style android. Now, obviously, I think they're intending it for it to exactly be Data, in my opinion, but they look obviously like Soong androids. And what's interesting about this is this message was supposedly set about 200,000 plus years ago by an alien race at this point that we don't know who is. And what's weird is that this device, when they touch it, it showed them an image of an android morphing, a generic android face morphing into a Soong-style android itself. So it's interesting how they knew that was going to happen, or does this device just project things that the user wants them to see, or is it somehow able to put into context what the message is trying to actually convey to the user and utilizing graphics and images that the user would understand? It's not quite clear how this whole thing works. I assume we're going to learn more about this in the next couple of episodes, but this whole thing is exactly what's going on with the Zhat Vash. Essentially, what happened is an alien race wrestled together about 8 suns and put a planet inside of it. That's where the Conclave of 8 comes from. And then the Zhat Vash, a while back ago, the Romulans, I should say, a while back ago, found this device. They touched it, and it showed them images of what would happen if synthetic life were to become, you know, sentient or whatever it is, and it would just basically become the destroyer of worlds and the end of everything. So they created the Zhat Vash in that moment in order to prevent that from happening, and they've been working in the shadows ever since to try to prevent that from occurring. We even get a really cool shot of all the 8 suns, which I assume is a planet we'll probably visit at some point inside of this season, perhaps even season 2. I don't know if we're going to be able to wrap all this stuff up here, but these are the 8 suns that this ancient race kind of lassoed together in order to, quote, get people's attention so that they would recognize and see this particular device. But what the hell does all of that stuff really mean? So this device is rather interesting. It's unclear to me if it's just showing the user images that it wants to see, or if it's displaying things and trying to transmit the warning/message in a way that the user can actually comprehend and understand. It's also unclear to me if synthetic android life rising up and then wiping out all organic life is the concern, or if it's a situation where once synthetic life reaches a certain tipping point, some other entity shows up and destroys all life to kind of keep things in check. I'm unclear as to what happens, because in the episode, they kind of allude a little bit to both, and I don't know if that's because the, you know, characters in the show aren't quite sure, or if there was an editing issue there, or maybe I'm not really understanding 100% what's going on, but it definitely was described a little bit like both. So I am curious to see if A, this warning is even actually legit, or if the Romulans just read this entire thing wrong, because they're very superstitious, very paranoid beings, so maybe it just interpreted what they thought, what the device thought that the Romulans wanted to see, and they just ran with it, or if it's an actual warning of some kind of threat of just sentient life in general, or if it's a warning of if sentient life reaches a certain point, then something happens and all life, period, is wiped out, and you definitely don't want this to happen, and that's why they set up this warning. It's unclear really what the heck is going on, but obviously, hopefully, we'll get some more information in episodes 9 and 10. Another theory that kind of comes up in my mind is what the heck is going on with Seven now and Elnor. She was obviously connected to the Borg cube, but then got disconnected. So she's got all these XBs that are running around and basically a cube to herself. So are we going to see a friendly Borg cube zipping around the quadrant under the command of Elnor/Seven? Or is she going to blow this up and leave with the XBs? Or I'm curious to see what they're going to be doing here with this cube. I hope that they don't blow it up. In fact, it'd be kind of cool to see a Borg cube warp into the fight, I assume most likely between this, you know, Federation squadron that's en route, that's probably going to have the Enterprise in it, that's going to be warping in to battle it out with the, you know, Romulan fleet that's going to arrive. Most likely all of them are going to arrive at the same location, which is that planet that, all of the, synthetic lives are being built on. And I'm wondering if this Borg cube is going to show up to maybe tip the scales. That would be really kind of cool, and I would love to see it in combat with modern visual effects and modern graphics. That would be really exciting. Okay, and the final thing that we're going to talk about really quickly is the preview that we saw at the end of the episode, which has some rather cool images that I wanted to show you guys and gals. But I wanted to let everyone know that we are going to be looking at a preview for episode 9, so this may be some extra spoilers that some of you guys may not want to see. So the first thing that we saw was this facility here, and I'm assuming by the narration while this particular clip was being shown is this is the facility that Bruce Maddox was utilizing to create his android beings, and this is on the planet that they are going to go and visit. It's kind of interesting. I don't really know what those weird little holographic candle things are, but I can't wait to see what's going on inside of there. And the other really cool thing that happened in the trailer was this weird-looking flower ship. Now, I do think that there's been kind of a connection to flowers throughout the entirety of this show. We saw them originally inside of Dahj's apartment. Dahj talks about how she was named after a specific type of flower, that her dad named him after that, and then flowers have been kind of a consistent theme throughout the rest of the show, kind of making various appearances here or there. And this looks like a giant flower ship. And we do know from the trailer that somehow or another they turn off all the power to La Serena, and they're kind of just stuck in the dark, which I thought was kind of a cool sequence. And I'm wondering if it's going to get a little bit spooky, a little bit horror-ish perhaps, a little bit more intense. But I am curious as to see what these ships are and kind of what they're all about. And are they entirely organic, or are there some mechanical structures to them? I can't wait to see what these are. This is quite interesting. Okay, everybody, that wraps up my review video. Again, let's try to keep your comments and feedback to me, as clean and as polite and as constructive as you can possibly make them. So let's not get devolved into too many arguments. I know I was a little tough on this episode, but again, I sat with this for quite a while, after watching it initially, and I sat with it before writing up my script for this episode review, and I watched it several more times after that because I didn't want to just immediately jump into, hey, I didn't really like this, but I thought about it a lot, and this is kind of how I feel. But I am curious to hear what you guys and gals think about my review of it and my theories for episodes 9 and 10 and kind of going into season 2. I'm curious to hear what you guys and gals think about that. So go ahead and get up your comments down below, and we'll go ahead and get the conversation started. Live long and prosper, my Trekkies!